Coming up next, they were the first band to really throw away the rule book. They were used to writing catchy #1 hits for everybody. But with today's brilliant concept album, they shatter the boundaries of song arrangement and forever changed the art of recorded music. And during the time that they were creating their masterpiece, they were actually in a race with another progressive band with a goal to create the greatest record ever. The pressure was on, the race was on. And this record that they did, it was only recorded on a 4-track machine. Now, the last cut on their groundbreaking record, it was a mind-altering composition inspired by the death of a notorious socialite, and it may have invented a whole new genre. Now, it had an accidental bridge that started out as its own song, and it was only meant to be filler, but in this song, it became a revelation. Now, this song, it would have been a surefire #1 hit, one of the greatest songs ever, but the band never put it out. But it was so exceptional, it put them in a class all their own, and it became the greatest album closer ever. See if you agree with me. We raised the curtain on this fantastic voyage across the perils of stone-cold realism and the fantasy of imagination. Coming up next, I'm Professor of Rock. Hey, music junkies, Professor of Rock, always here to celebrate the greatest artists and the greatest songs of all time, especially today. If you want the stories of your favorite songs straight from the legends who created these compositions, make sure that you subscribe below right now. Again, we get it straight from the horse's mouth. Make sure to click the bell so you never miss out on our latest. Also, for full interviews and other exclusive content, make sure to click on our Patreon link. That helps us keep this a daily channel. So it's time for another edition of #1 in Our Hearts. This is where we honor a song that absolutely should have been a #1 hit on the Billboard Hot 100. And this one's a no-brainer. It changed everything by the greatest band of their time, if not all time. It began with the title In the Life Of, and it evolved into A Day in the Life, a track by the Beatles. Acclaimed as an avant-garde masterpiece, the impetus of this song came from John Lennon's random perusing of the British newspaper, the Daily Mail, when he learned of the death of his friend, Tara Brown. That led to the first line of the song, I read the news today, oh boy. One of the greatest first lines ever.
I read the news today, oh boy.
John Lennon and Paul McCartney, the co-authors of A Day in the Life, they actually knew Tara Brown very well. He was the 21-year-old heir of the Guinness fortune, popular Irish stout beer brand. Brown was constantly in the tabloids as a notorious socialite, labeled as a spoiled rich kid from the swinging London counterculture of the 60s, who, spent lavishly on wild parties. Brown once hired the band The Lovin' Spoonful over £1,000 to play a private concert just for him. His most infamous party was the celebration of his 21st birthday held at his parents' manor in the Wicklow Mountains. Brown paid for private jets to fly all 200 of his guests to this party, including celebrities like Michael Caine, Peter Sellers, Mick Jagger, Brian Jones, and Paul McCartney, who ended up not being able to attend because the Beatles were recording at Abbey Road. It's been widely documented that Brown was the person that convinced Paul McCartney to take LSD for the very first time. Even though John, George, and Ringo had been regularly using LSD, Sir Paul resisted the baiting of his bandmates for a very long time before succumbing to the peer pressure of Tara Brown. On December 17, 1966, Brown was driving on the streets of London in his Lotus Elan sports car with his girlfriend, model Suki Poitier. He was reportedly speeding in the excess of 100 miles an hour. This is when he ran a red light and he smashed into a parked truck. The injuries from the crash proved fatal, and Brown was pronounced dead just a few hours after the accident. His girlfriend, Suki, she was not hurt. She told authorities that Brown sharply turned the wheel so that his side of the car would take the impact of the crash, in a mad effort to save her life. However, the official report stated that Brown was driving under the influence of alcohol and drugs. Test results indicated that he had a pint of alcohol in his system at the time. Bottom line is, if he really wanted to save his girlfriend's life, Brown really shouldn't have been behind the wheel. Now, 14 years later in Portugal, Suki, his girlfriend, she wasn't so fortunate. At the age of 33, Poitier was killed in another car crash. It also took the life of her husband, Robert Ho. That was in 1981. The news about Brown's death was not surprising to John Lennon. He knew that he was literally on a collision course. Brown told everyone that he wanted to be a race car driver, and he lived his life on the edge. John Lennon was friends with Brown, but he wasn't as close to him as Paul McCartney was. When Lennon read about Brown's death, he thought the whole thing was full of irony. At the time of his death, the world was Tara Brown's oyster. I mean, he was just 4 years from inheriting the equivalent of more than $15 million in today's money.
Nobody was really sure if he was from the House of Lords.
So getting back to Tara Brown, who was the socialite killed in that car wreck, the headline in the Daily Mail said it all. Dead. A boy who had everything. Verse 1 of A Day in the Life to Brown, with Lennon calling him a lucky man who made the grade, adding, though the news was rather sad, I just had to laugh.
Well, I just had to laugh.
John Lennon didn't try to duplicate the details of Tara Brown's demise, that were printed in the newspaper article for A Day in the Life. For example, Brown did not blow his mind out, as Lennon wrote in the song. Most people would think that meant suicide. But he stated that what he had in his mind while writing that first verse was the image of a man on a suicide run.
He blew his mind out in a car.
I also read into it myself that it could mean because he was high when he was driving and got into a fatal car wreck, he did, in fact, blow his mind out in a car. Now, the last line in the first verse, nobody was really sure if he was from the House of Lords. That one confused Paul McCartney, on what the song was about after John had presented it to him. That's because someone from the House of Lords is a member of the UK Parliament. And Paul thought the subject of John's tune was a stone politician at first.
Nobody was really sure if he was from the House of Lords.
Now, verse 2 begins with John saying, I saw a film today, oh boy. The English army had just won the war. That's, of course, a reference to How I Won the War, the British black comedy that John Lennon had acted in.
The English army had just won the war.
John Lennon kicks off his third verse in A Day in the Life with what is essentially the vocal hook of the song. I read the news today, oh boy.
I read the news today, oh boy.
And used an excerpt from a column with the heading Far and Near in the January 17th edition of the UK Daily Express. 4,000 holes in Blackburn, Lancashire.
4,000 holes in Blackburn, Lancashire.
And though the holes were rather small, they had to count them all. Lennon's friend Terry Dolan helped him finish the verse. And when John read the verse to him, Dolan responded with, fill the Albert Hall, John.
Now they know how many holes it takes to fill the Albert Hall.
The verses on A Day in the Life, they were a collection of current event realism from the eye of the beholder, Mr. John Lennon. His musings were affecting, they were mysterious, and very thought-provoking.
I saw the photograph.
Contrary to a typical Beatles recording, the bizarre detour on A Day in the Life, that was delivered by Sir Paul McCartney, not by John Lennon. Actually, the roles were reversed. It was Paul who came up with the lysergic-induced phase, I'd love to turn you on, which was indeed a drug reference. McCartney's bridge in A Day in the Life, which I might add, the best bridge ever, that was a 180 mind twist that seemingly had nothing to do with the theme of the song. Sort of like an inexplicable part of a dream that suddenly bursts out of your subconscious. And it was a harbinger of sorts to the incohesive stylings in McCartney's solo hit Uncle Albert.
Found my coat and grabbed my hat. Made the bus in seconds flat. The butter wouldn't melt, so put it in the pie. All right.
The lyrics in the bridge were originally intended to be used for another Beatles song. A lot of people don't realize that. But Paul and John, they decided to use it as filler. Not filler at all. Best bridge ever. Found my way upstairs and had a smoke. Somebody spoke and I went into a dream.
Found my way upstairs and had a smoke. And somebody spoke and I went.
Now the mention of having a smoke, that was translated by pretty much everybody who listened to it as smoking marijuana. And of course, the song was subsequently banned for airplay by the BBC. That ban was later lifted, though, after author David Story chose A Day in the Life as one of his Desert Island discs.
And I went into a dream.
When the Beatles were preparing for the recording of Sgt. Pepper's Lonely Hearts Club Band, the Fab Four were tired of doling out live concerts. They were bored with the conventional procession of recording an album. It was becoming also ran for them. After all, Sgt. Pepper would be their 8th studio album, and they wanted to throw away the rule book, and boy did they ever. They incorporated a variety of stylistic influences that were centered around a concept of a fictional band that was invented by Paul McCartney. It would be an alter ego of the Beatles, and that would give John, Paul, George, and Ringo, the Fab Four, the liberty to do whatever they wanted to do. They were also in a bit of a race to create the next great sound, the great masterpiece of popular music. This is after they heard the Beach Boys' superb opus Pet Sounds. In fact, at this time, Brian Wilson was creating Dumb Angel, or what would eventually become Smile, Teenage Symphony to God. This was happening at the same time, and the two bands were inspiring one another. You think about it, Brian Wilson wrote Pet Sounds after being blown away by Rubber Soul. That's a story for another day. But let me know in the comments if you'd like me to cover the great rock and roll race of 1967, Smile versus Sgt. Pepper, one of the most interesting rock stories I've ever heard. Now, the sessions for Sgt. Pepper, they didn't follow the usual trappings of the studio, where what was being recorded was private and very secretive. Instead, the Beatles invited dozens of friends, including fellow musicians, socialites, media reps, and childhood chums. They all turned into the sessions like it was a big party. The sessions for A Day in the Life were particularly festive, starting with the hiring of a 41-piece orchestra. The decision to hire the orchestra, that was a mutual one between Paul and John, but actually Paul was the instigator. The band instructed the orchestral players to show up at the studio dressed in formal attire, and then they handed out novelty items for them to wear, like clown noses and gorilla gloves and party hats. Proving once again that he can do it all, Sir Paul conducted that orchestra. Paul's first directive was for the musicians to start playing their instruments in the lowest key possible, and then gradually raising the scale to the highest note. Paul's objective was to create a crescendo for the middle of A Day in the Life. With a rising glissando effect with a thundering climax, reminiscent of Entry of the Gods into Valhalla from the Wagnerian opera Das Rheingold. Now, after Lennon's vibrating "I'd Love to Turn You On," the first bridge begins with a count-off, 7, 8, 9, 10 by Mal Evans. He was the Beatles' tour manager. It was followed by the sound of a real alarm clock that rings at the 24th bar, alerting the Beatles that it was almost time to resume playing the track. And then Paul takes over.
Woke up.
Evans, who after the breakup of the Beatles became a troubled soul and was shot to death by police after a bizarre incident in LA. That crescendo in the second and final bridge is even more intense, and then the song ends with one of the most revered chords in music history. Played on multiple keyboards, sustaining the drama for more than 40 seconds. That famous piano chord, played by 20 different parts, 4 by Paul, 4 by John, 4 by Ringo, 4 by Mal Evans, and Sir George, actually played several keyboards and a harmonium. Since A Day in the Life was the last cut on Sgt. Pepper, the Beatles intentionally ended the track with a bang. After the final note, Lennon told Martin to dub in a high-pitched tone that most humans can't hear, but, makes dogs go bonkers. That inhuman shriek was followed by a loop of unintelligible voices and studio noise, before we hear voices say, Never Could See Any Other Way, Never Been This High, and What's That? They were all spliced together. The objective by the Beatles for this wonderfully strange finale was so when fans played out the groove on the LP vinyl, it would sound like something went horribly wrong with the recording. It was very intentional. Sgt. Pepper, man, what can you say about this thing? Many have called it the greatest album of all time. It's been hailed as the first art rock album and the first concept album that lit the path for blockbuster albums that would follow, like Pink Floyd's Dark Side of the Moon, and of course Tommy by The Who, and David Bowie's Rise and Fall of Ziggy Stardust.
Waiting for someone or something to show you the way.
That being said, A Day in the Life is the piece de resistance on Sgt. Pepper. When A Day in the Life was finished and it was ready for playback, the Beatles were generous about playing their avant-garde masterpiece for all their friends. Everyone was blown away by what they heard. I believe the late David Crosby, he had the most memorable account of what he heard. In an interview some years ago with Filter magazine, Cros stated that he was, as near as he knew, the first human being other than the band and George Martin and the engineers to hear A Day in the Life. He admitted that he was high as a kite, so high he was hunting green with a rake, is what he said. The Fab Four sat Cros down in the studio. They surrounded him with massive speakers that Crosby said looked like coffins with wheels on that rolled up on either side of the stool that he was sitting on. By the time the song got to Paul's piano chord, Cros said his brains were on the floor. Unquestionably, A Day in the Life is a mind-altering, landmark recording. There's so much going on in this song. I hear something different every single time I listen to it. The song itself is like serotonin for the brain. Incredibly, the Beatles, George Martin, and Jeff Emmerich were able to create one of the most innovative and adventurous compositions with archaic 4-track tape machines. Flexibility, of course, was limited since all the sounds that were captured in that recording had to be created in the moment of those 4 tracks. That is a staggering fact. It's just hard to comprehend in this computer age of unlimited technology that we find ourselves in now. The Beatles have recorded so many amazing songs. That's why they've been larger than life since their international breakthrough in 1962, even though by 1970, they disbanded and they went their separate ways. A Day in the Life ranks as one of the greatest sound engineering and artistic achievements ever, if not the greatest. I mean, it's mind blown every time I hear this song. Okay, I just freak out about this song. Going back to Tara Brown, the light bulb inspiration for the song's conception, the Rolling Stones co-leader Keith Richards, he was shattered by Brown's death for many years. Richards named his second son Tara after Tara Brown. Sadly, Tara Richards was born prematurely and died shortly after birth. McCartney still owns a piano which he had painted in the same psychedelic pattern that adorned an AC Cobra sports car that Tara actually owned. He had a big impact on these guys. A Day in the Life actually sparked a conspiracy theory, as we all know, that it was McCartney and not Brown who had died in a car crash and a lookalike had taken his place in the band. Of course, contributing to the urban legend, Paul is dead. It's a subject for another episode, many episodes actually. I can still remember my dad opening the gatefold of Sgt. Pepper's Lonely Hearts Club Band and, pointing out several clues that he and his friends were theorizing upon. I remember the first time my dad played this song for me. Never forget it. I'll tell you what he said in just a second, but I want to say that the late Jeff Beck reinterpreted this song amazingly. There are also some other great versions, Barry Gibb, The Fall, Fish.
I saw a film today,
Sting has an incredible live recording of this song. Also, A Day in the Life with its spectacular surround sound exhilaration That also inspired the creation of Deep Note, the audio trademark for the THX Film Company. Okay, so the reason A Day in the Life wasn't a #1 hit, it's simple. It wasn't released as a single. But even if the Beatles had released it, it was so far ahead of its time, I'm not sure the masses would have embraced it to get it to #1. You know, actually though, now that I think about it, Sgt. Pepper, the album, that went to #1 and it sold 11 million copies. So I actually take that back. I think it would have hit #1. Sorry. As for what my dad said, right before he put the needle on the vinyl, he said, "You're about to hear a song that will blow your mind out." Quoting John Lennon exactly. Like David Crosby, after the song was over, my brain was on the floor.
And somebody spoke and I went into a dream.
Seriously, just mind-blowing. I can't say enough about this song. And you know, decades after my dad showed it to me, I did the same thing with my eldest son a couple of years back. I passed it on with my dad's own introduction, word for word. You're about to hear a song that's going to blow your mind out. The power of music. Leave us a comment about the Beatles and A Day in the Life. This absolutely mind-altering composition. Have you shared the song with your kids, with their kids, and on and on? This is a song that needs to be shared. What are your thoughts on Sgt. Pepper, the race between the Beach Boys and the Beatles? Let us know in the comments. If you like our content, we do invite you to be a full-time subscriber by subscribing below. Until next time, 3 chords and the truth, my friends.